Well, today, as you all know, is the last day of the conference. We hope you have enjoyed yesterday and the previous day. And today, we would like to thank the Directorate General in translation from Spain with Luis González, who is sponsoring today's activities. And we have the Translating Europe workshop. As you can see, it's entitled Teamwork in Multilingual Settings in Crisis or Emergency Situations, Best Practices, Challenges, and New Horizons. So today's activities will be carried out, taking that in mind. So without further delay, I give you the floor, Luis.
Thank you, Carmen. Good morning. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to everybody. Instead of co-moderating the first roundtable as it was in the program with Carmen, which would not be very operative and would only take time away from the speaker, the main protagonist, I prefer to share with you a very brief introduction to this last day of the Congress, which is held more specifically under the label of Translating Europe Workshop. As our DG Christos Elenides mentioned yesterday, Translating Europe project is one of the main way to convey, to organize our outreach activities with a certain consistency and regularity. Our main mission is to translate. That is obvious. This is our main and principal mission is translate European Commission text into all official languages. But in this task, we face almost the same challenge as the rest of the sector and the professionals. So, of course, as institutional translator working for a large institutions like European Commissions, we could say, on the safe side, no? But we don't want to hide in our ivory tower. So I invite you to consult the complete programming schedule of the Translating Europe workshop events in the different member states, and also the global event, annual event in Brussels. All are available with interpretation into English, or most of them are available with interpretation into English, and many are recorded and accessible at any time. So we feel very identified with this seminar, with the workshop, with the Congress, with the context of this workshop. Public service translation and interpreting is very close to our work. As civil servants, our professional concerns are essentially the same. We are concerned about teamwork, as is today in the program, ethics, and good practice, obviously. We are, of course, concerned about technology. Technology, as it was mentioned yesterday, is not just an issue. It is the issue for us, as for all the professions closely related to technological improvement. We are also concerned about the emergency of new terminological domains, as, for example, today in the program, cyberspace crimes. We are here and we support the debate because we say that what you will say here is of great interest to us. We try to convey the message to the institutions in our comprehensive reporting work, and we take note. We keep taking note also for the conclusions today. So I wish you a day full of interesting reflections and debates. I will also mention that we are open to, as Director General mentioned yesterday, we are open to academia, to language industry, but we are also open to to our counterparts in public administration service. 13 years ago, I bring with me some copies, a white paper on the translating and interpreting sector in the public administration in Spain. In this paper, we have reflected on the ways to implement the directive on translation in criminal proceedings. Some ideas are still pending. So the implementation of this directive is very complicated, but the main idea were here is work from DGT with Service of Translation of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain. So we keep open to all the conclusions. We follow the debates, disseminate and convey into the administration, so the public administration. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have some copies of the book in case you want to take one or take a look at it outside. Thank you. So now we will begin the plenary conference, and I am very happy to introduce Jos Morkens. He is an associate professor at the School of Applied Language and Intercultural Studies in Dublin City University, challenge leader at the ADAPT Centre and member of DCU's Institute of Ethics and Center for Translation and Textual Studies. He has authored and also co-authored journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers on translation technology, machine translation, post-editing, user evaluation of machine translation, translator precarity, and translation ethics. He's general co-editor of the Translation Spaces Journal with Professor Dorothy Kenny, and he's the co-editor of a number of books and journal special issues, and also co-author of Translation Tools and Technologies. He leads the technology working group as a board member of the EMT, the European Masters in Translation Network. So whenever you're ready, Jos.
Thanks very much, Carmen. First of all, I'd like to thank Carmen Valero, Carmen Peña, Raquel for organizing this and for inviting me along. It's a real pleasure to be in this beautiful university, and I'd like to thank the DGT for sponsoring the Translation Europe workshop. It's great to have the DG, Christos Elenidis, here. My thanks and apologies in advance to the interpreters. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the state of the art in language technology, about ethics, sustainability, and effects on vulnerable users. My perspective is that there's loads of benefits to be had from technology, but we need to be careful in their use, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. There's loads of, let me see if I can move this forward. It's a real hot topic in translation ethics at the moment. We've got 3 books that have come out just within the last 12 to 18 months. Really notable was Kaisa Koskinen and Nika Pokorn's co-edited Routledge Handbook of Translation and Ethics, which is a terrific resource. Within the last 2 weeks, we have both Towards Responsible Machine Translation, co-edited by Helena Moniz and Carla Pare-Escartin, and Joseph Lambert's Translation Ethics. So there's more discussion of ethics in translation than ever before. And this is probably because of a general discussion to do with technology and ethics. As more and more of our work and our lives are technologized, this has become a real hot topic. So today I want to speak a little bit about the state of the art in translation and MT ethics, sustainability, machine translation and vulnerable users, and a little bit about the ubiquitous large language models, which we've already heard a little bit about. How do I move forward? There we go. So a little bit about how ethics have been discussed in translation studies. Early discussions were mostly to do with ethics as fidelity, so trying to be true to the original message. So the sort of work on functionalism by Christiane Nord, looking at the various loyalties of translators. And then Chesterman and Pym in the late 1990s brought things on from translation ethics to translator ethics, talking about relationships, the importance of trust. Trust was something that came up yesterday in Barbara Houghton's presentation. And Kaisa Koskinen highlighted in 2000 the complexity in practice, so that it's difficult to just use a set of rules to decide what's right or wrong, good or bad in translation, because it's a very complex process. Maria Timashko and Christina Abdallah have written about asymmetries of power, Joe Drugan on social responsibility and responsibilities to clients, and more recently Michael Cronin and Gukhan Firat on distributed production networks and data or digital platforms and the various complexities involved. But as Kaisa Koskinen and Nika Pokorn said, translatorial activities are by definition located in an intersection, in transit areas between entities, and they involve more than one language, culture, readership, and interlocutor. They're ripe with bigger and smaller ethical dilemmas. So ethics is a really appropriate topic in translation. So that we're all on the same page, I'd like to have a small introduction to how we view ethics. So reporting on what Socrates said when he was put to death, where he said that the important thing is not to live, but to live well. Ethics helps us to question what is living well, what is the good life, and not just a life that's acceptable, but one that's wonderful, that's admirable. So we might use meta-ethics to ask about the nature of moral judgments. Theoretical ethics might help us to ask what is the best theory of the good life. So here we have got consequentialism, trying to decide what's good or bad based on the consequences of our actions. So here we might have utilitarianism. We make a decision as to what decision will create the least harm. Then we have deontological ethics, where we have a set of rules. This is what's often used within translation organization. We have a set of rules to decide or help us to decide what's a good or a bad action to take. And then we have virtue ethics, where Aristotle put forward the idea of a set of virtues, that if we try and follow these virtues or act according to these virtues, it will lead to human flourishing. Then we have applied ethics. So in applied ethics, so for example, business ethics, computer and information ethics, technology ethics, this helps us to answer how we should act in this or that situation based upon our best theories of ethics. So ethics in translation, back to Koskinen and Pokorn, they define this as the subfield that aims to understand what is good and bad, right and wrong in translatorial praxis. So myself and Marta Rocky wrote a chapter about business ethics, about ethics in the translation industry for the handbook that I'd mentioned. And within the industry, it's a very multifarious industry. We've got large companies that are very profit-focused, and we saw that they hadn't really moved on from the Milton Friedman credo from 1970, which says that the social responsibility of an organization is to increase its profits. But in the 1990s, there was a greater idea of corporate social responsibility. So Carol suggested this pyramid of corporate social responsibility that we see on the right-hand side of this slide. So the biggest responsibility is economic responsibilities, to be profitable, to be successful, to be efficient, to provide profit to shareholders. So that's the main foundation upon which the others rest. Then subordinate to that are legal responsibilities, to obey the law, and not just to obey the law, but to obey the spirit of the law, as law's society's codification of right and wrong. Subordinate to that are ethical responsibilities, to be ethical, to act according to societal mores, to ethical standards, the obligation to do what's right, just and fair, and to avoid harm. Then subordinate to that are philanthropic responsibilities, to be a good corporate citizen, to contribute to education, to the arts, to culture. Moving on from that, in 1994, George Elkington put forward the idea of the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. And he intended these to be all of equal importance, and complained in 2018 that companies use this as a form of accounting, of balancing one up against the other, when actually he wanted to foment complete system change. And then DeGeorge in 2014 talked about the importance of respecting the rights of employees, consumers, and society in general. Dominic Millay, who is a priest based in Italy who writes a lot about ethics, he's divided companies into ones that pursue the shareholder approach, the stakeholder approach. So stakeholders, and I'll come back to this, are people who are involved closely or tangentially in a company, or the common good approach. So the common good approach takes ethics as a guide for human excellence. So he says that business ethics can be a guide for human excellence in business organizations. And he says that following the... A little closer. Okay, thank you. He says that following the common good or the stakeholder approach doesn't necessarily mean that we're ignoring shareholders. So it doesn't mean that we're ignoring the profit motive, just that we're trying to focus on excellence on within an organization and within the group of people, rather than just seeing a business or a company as a set of contracts to be fulfilled. So stakeholder theory is a way to look at the different people who have a stake in a company. This is something that's often used in writing on ethics. It's something myself and Marta used in 2021. So here we've looked at language service providers and the various stakeholders involved, externally and internally, including in-house translators, project managers, owners. And it's a way to try and measure what the effects of a decision are, who has benefits, who does not have benefits. So Ed Freeman suggested stakeholder theory in 1984 to consider any group or individual who can affect or is affected by the achievement of an organization's objectives. And then John Phillips put forward this idea of a further division between what he called normative and derivative stakeholders. Normative being people who are directly involved, maybe within the company, the employees, the people who purchase from the company. And then derivative, perhaps people living in the local area or people who report on the company. In translation, myself and Marta considered disparities of power, ownership of resources, sustaining employment, ethics training as continuous professional development, and the importance of trust. So these are all things to consider within a company, and we argued that especially some of the larger companies are more focused on a cost model rather than a value model, and I'll come back to these also in a few moments. So looking at technology, there's a growing consensus about the importance of ethics and technology, as technology increasingly shapes how human beings seek the good life and with what degree of success. So, for example, a technology can help us to achieve the good life by promoting things that are safe or positive, or it can also promote things that are negative, so some sort of toxification of the environment or bad habits, bad practices. And there is an idea put forward by a lot of technologists, especially people developing technology, that technologies are ethically neutral, whereas the view in ethics and philosophy of technology is increasingly that technologies are not ethically neutral. Langdon Winner in 1983 said that technologies engender specific worldviews. Melvin Kranzberg wrote about technologies not being neutral, and more recently Andrew Feenberg. They reveal and shape what humans value and think good. So there are decisions behind the decision to implement a technology, how it's implemented, how those ideas are put into action, who it's intended for, the sort of interface we use, the sort of data that we gather, where that data is stored, how transparent we are about the gathering of that data, and lots of different things that are decided by the developers that really are ethical decisions, even though they might not think of them as such. And it's especially important now, but for reasons of fairness, of justice, of responsibility, because the speed, the scale, and pervasiveness of technology means that policy and law is inevitably at least one step behind. An example is the draft Artificial Intelligence Act that's currently being discussed within the institutions in Europe, and there are lots of ramifications potentially of this, one of which is to do with algorithmic management, which is something I'll come to in a little while, and that would be ruled out within the AI Act. However, it's not law as of yet. 21st century technologies are reshaping the global distribution of power, of justice, of responsibility, and often the positive and negative effects are distributed unevenly. So the question is, how do we ensure that access to these new enormous benefits promised by new technologies and exposure to their risks are distributed in what we might consider the right way? A lot of these new technologies are based on big data, which are large digital data sets plus new techniques, organizations, and processes to transform those data sets into valuable human knowledge. Some people are very positive about big data. So Meyer Schoenberger and Cookier, who wrote this book, said that big data's value is in current and potential future use. Jaron Lanier, who's a little bit more circumspect about big data, said that both big data and artificial intelligence are economic and political constructions that disenfranchise most people. In translation, there's a huge growth in the production of digital data. There are more types of data gathered in translation than ever before. This idea of data is the new oil is the idea that data is naturally occurring and is there to be harvested. Big data is driving new businesses and processes, and consideration of ethics, I feel, can help with decision making and may also present opportunities, what Anthony Pym called the ability to learn to trust and mistrust data. So the types of data that's gathered in translation, well, we've been gathering bilingual translation data since the use of the first CAT tools that contain translation memory in 1992. And increasingly, there are other types of data gathered within particularly digital platforms. Often the desktop tools can gather this sort of data as well, increasingly. So timing data, how long did it take to translate a segment or a document? Timing data to ask, how long was a user active on a task? Keystrokes, so these are the sort of things that were gathered within platforms for research and translation process research over the last few years. These are now common within translation platforms. Gathering of keystrokes, mouse clicks, translation quality evaluation, the timeliness of delivery, communication skills, job and domain type, adherence to instructions and deadlines, so for example regarding layout and formatting, and then of course these can be added to demographic data, and we can make inferences about the user based on this mix of data. So some of this I know sounds quite vague, but actually these types of data are used to make decisions within a platform on translation. So for example, translated.com have an algorithm called T-Rank. They've gathered data on over 1 million different translation projects and have, to their great credit, published about this and been very open. So the data that they use to make a decision as to whether to employ another translator or to offer them a job includes this group of data types. And I don't mean to be harsh about translated, because within a comparison of Fair Work based in Oxford, they compared translation and transcription platforms and scored translated and transcribed me very highly in terms of the minimum standards of fair work, in terms of fair pay, fair management, fair representation. And the top 2 companies also engaged with Fair Work and changed their terms and conditions in response to this scoring. Vela Valido in 2021 published about WordBee quality ratings. So WordBee they create a score for a translator based on the daily worked volume, daily assigned volume, job acceptance time, timeliness rating, adherence to instructions, reliability, jobs completed on time, etc. So you can see in a test here that she received 4.8 overall, 4.6 for work quality, 5 for timeliness, 4.8 for friendliness. So while this is all well and good, it's not always transparent to the user how they're being scored. They might receive no job offers if, maybe they've suffered a bereavement, maybe they're a bit unwell, maybe their work hasn't been quite at the quality that's expected, and that can have real repercussions. And it's difficult to argue with an algorithm. There are other types of scoring being used in industry. So for example, the ProdaScore Happiness Index tries to look at the happiness and satisfaction of employees based on internal communication. So the idea being that the most positive scores are beneficial. Those that are particularly negative, the idea is that they're bad apples and should be managed out of the organization. If we look at the statements with negative emotional attribution on the right, some of them are negative. Wow, bunch of BS, I'm right with you. Then I do not feel good. I think that's a little bit more arbitrary. But the worry here is that if working within a translation platform, that translators will start to feel they have to adhere to the algorithm, to the decisions of the platform. And this is natural. It's something that Adorno and Horkheimer predicted in 1947, where they talked about workers molding themselves to the technical apparatus, body and soul. Jarahi and Sutherland in 2019, writing about digital platforms, not specifically in translation, more for crowdsourcing, said that the ability to understand and make use of algorithms has become a core competency of workers attempting to retain autonomy. So my feeling here is that we have a set of norms put forward by Tory, by Chesterman, and Chesterman suggested there were expectancy norms and professional norms that translators will follow. However, this is a consideration of the end user, the end reader. However, if our work and our continuing work is based on satisfying an algorithm, surely an algorithmic norm is going to slot in somewhere higher here. And the first and most efficient method for a translator within a digital platform will be satisfying the needs of the algorithm and reverse engineering what decisions are made. There are loads of ethical issues to do with machine translation systems training. This illustration is from Puck magazine from 1868, right around the time the Berne Convention was published. And the pirate publisher here, he is someone who's publishing works internationally, taking works from different countries. We see different flags behind him and publishing them completely freely without paying any royalties. So the Berne Convention was intended to prevent that. But also, it codified translation as a derivative work, subject to the rights of the original author. So the repercussion of this is still seen in data ownership. Who owns a translation? It's a derivative work. There's an argument by Troussel and Debush, who wrote the Bird and Bird report, which was commissioned by the European Commission in 2014. They feel that translators should have rights to some of their data, particularly if it's creative translation or if it's translation of a creative work. However, in practice, this hasn't been legally tested at all, and the barrier to jump to prove that something is original is actually not that high, but for individual translators, it's difficult to make that argument. Troussel and Debush also suggest that translators should have rights of ownership of their translation memories if they've made a substantial effort into creating and maintaining those translation memories under the EU database directive. Again, that's not something that's commonly done. A lot of translation contracts will stipulate that the translation memory and the data is to be handed back. So data ownership is a thorny issue. Myself and Dave Lewis had a proposal in a paper in 2019 where we discussed the potential of creating a digital commons, a knowledge commons that was managed by the community, and to have tiered access to the community, something that I think has been discussed within the language data space to an extent. But then for the language data space, this is managed by the European institutions. If something like this was done and owned by the community, then where would the payments go and to what level? It's still a tricky thing to work out. Permission to use data is also highly controversial. So some translators, we assume a degree of collegiality when translators work with translation memory, that they're happy for other humans to use their translation data. Some translators aren't happy with the data being used for training of machine translation on principle, but there's usually not really an opportunity to make that decision, how or where it can be reused. If it's being reused for perhaps an arms manufacturer, that something that they might be ethically opposed to, there's no opportunity to prevent that. Data distribution is an issue. Where the data is held, will it be held, if you're a European citizen, will it be held within Europe where it's subject to GDPR? And we're seeing more and more mergers and acquisitions within the translation space. Dominic Graham from Deloitte in 2019 identified 81 different mergers and acquisitions within the translation space within the previous 6 years. And of course, since then, we've seen SDL and Moravia, RWS Moravia merged together. We've seen SDI and Iuno Media merge together to provide or to create the biggest AVT company globally. But of course, when these companies acquire another company, they acquire their data. And there's a lack of control over where the data goes or what happens to your data after it's relinquished. Translation memories can be considered personal data, as usually a name or a pseudonym is appended to a translation memory, which is another issue. And when we look at MT in professional workflows, we might consider these different ethical issues and what effects they have on different people who are involved. So myself and Anna Gerber of Aranas looked at the MT stakeholder ecosystem, again using the stakeholder approach in a paper that actually came out in that Responsible Machine Translation book last week, where we consider clients, agencies, shareholders, end users and tool developers, and consider these different ethical issues, how they affect them, and particularly the areas of risk and liability, and how that might fall on end users, especially those that don't have a high degree of MT literacy. So MT literacy is a concept that was put forward by Bowker and Ciro Buitrago, the idea being that, that a user would understand appropriate or inappropriate use of MT, roughly how MT is created, what data might be used for MT, and what risks appropriate or inappropriate uses. The common orthodoxy for the use of MT that we've proposed within DCU, coming from work from my colleague Andy Way in 2013, is that the level of automation should be according to the level of risk, the value, and the shelf life of translated content. So if your content is of low value, of low risk, has a low shelf life, so for example, a TripAdvisor review, something that's going to be superseded quite quickly, or a tweet where the average half-life is 2 hours, then it's obviously appropriate to use machine translation. However, as machine translation quality has improved since neural machine translation, and because of the amount of technology hype, there's a tendency to push MT into new use cases where perhaps it's less appropriate. But automation isn't an all or nothing decision. And for the last 20 or so years, or even more, this is from 2000 from Parasuraman et al., they define automation as the full or partial replacement of a function previously carried out by a human operator. So this implies that automation is not all or none, but can vary across a continuum of levels, from the lowest level of fully manual performance to the highest level of full automation. So at number 1, we see a computer offering no assistance. Humans must take all decisions or actions. And actually, we don't really see any translation at that level at this stage, even if you're working within a word processor interface like Microsoft Word. There'll still be spelling or grammar suggestions. So it's not fully non-automated. That'll be hard to interpret, sorry. Mental note, use actual words. Number 2, the computer offers a complete set of decision action alternatives. Moving forward, it narrows the selection down to a few. So, for example, within a CAT or translation memory tool, we'll have a narrowed down selection. The computer might suggest one alternative. So if we're working with machine translation and it's propagated into our target text window, we'll be at level 4. Or execute a suggestion if the human approves. So if, for example, you're working with interactive machine translation within a tool like Lilt, where you see the translation and you're pressing return to accept each word, but you can make an adjustment, and then an appropriate adjustment will be made for the rest of the segment. That will be at level 5. Once we move above level 5, the computer starts to take control, allowing the human to veto or necessarily inform the human, or informing the human if asked, or informing the human if only if the computer decides to. And at level 10, the computer decides everything, acts autonomously, ignoring the human. So a fully raw MT producing workflow would be at level 10. But our approaches to automation can also differ based on, I mentioned earlier, the cost or value strategy. So the cost strategy uses technology to reduce costs, especially by trying to reduce labor costs, whereas a value strategy might aim to increase the value by complementing labor with technology or reassigning labor to higher value work. So approach number one is to replace everything. Number two is to atomize, automate. So here we break work down into chunks. So if, for example, we look at the production of a lot of audiovisual translation for subtitling at the moment, so particularly for premium Korean dramas, there's 15-minute chunks sent out to individual translators. They have to subtitle and translate within a fixed period of time, often 90 minutes to 120 minutes. This work is then sent back to a project manager who does a quick cursory check, reassembles the work, and then this is sent out. And this is how the English language version is created for those Korean dramas. And pardon me. And this is the pivot language from which all the others are created. And as a result, there's no chance to go back and to edit that original translation. So there are repercussions of this sort of work, and I'll come to those in a moment. The automation approach number three is to relieve things that are dull, dirty, or dangerous. So that was the idea that Martin Kay put forward for the original notion of translation memory in his Proper Place of Men and Machines in Translation. Then to empower, to automate what wasn't even being done before. So I mentioned work being decomposed into chunks, and this is something I wrote about in 2020 in an article about digital Taylorism, which encompasses this breaking down into chunks with the addition of an element of surveillance. So an example here is crowd work from Unbabel, Lionbridge, and Transperfect. And it's something Sharon O'Brien talked about as early as 2012, how translation jobs are becoming smaller in some domains, where the notion of a text with a beginning, a middle, and an end has changed radically. So an example from the Unbabel workflow is a customer submitting a text, it's machine translated, the individual segments, because that's the level that translation automatic evaluation works at, the individual segments are given a quality check. If individual segments are considered not good enough, they're sent to the Unbabel community, who will post-edit or who will translate the segment from scratch, then send it back, and those finished tasks are combined again, and the customer gets the translated text. So my concern here is the amount of job satisfaction and the motivation that someone will have when they're working with decomposed pieces of text or a decomposed piece of an audiovisual product. Breaking things down into chunks is not the only method being used in industry. Something that Alan Melby and Jos Zetsche have put forward recently is this idea of translation grades, but actually this has already been implemented within the industry. So this example is from HubSpot, from the Born to be Global blog, which is written by Natalie Kelly, the VP of Localization. She breaks content, or within HubSpot, they break content down into three different basic categories. So touchless means that it's completely automated, most likely NMT, low touch, usually MT post-editing, high touch, a tech-enabled workflow with the human in control using CAT tools, translation memory, translation edit, proofread. And we see these sort of workflows also in Microsoft. They automatically break things down based on product line, and within software documentation, they divide the documentation based on how commonly it's used. So the most popular support pages will be those where there's substantial human involvement. Then the next 10% or so might be post-edited, the rest machine translated. So if, for example, you're looking at a Microsoft support page in Spanish, and at the bottom it says, did this solve your problem? Or were you satisfied? And you have to answer yes or no. By saying yes, you're giving tacit approval to the translation standard or translation quality. So there are a couple of paths forward that have been suggested, one by Arl Lommel and CSA Research, based in the northeast of the USA. He suggests responsive machine translation will be the way forward. That's automatically domain adapted. that's contextually aware, and context is a real live topic within MT research at the moment, trying to figure out what the best contextual window is to try and look at things more at the document rather than segment level. Being adaptive based on feedback to incorporate user resources and to automatically match with requirements for applicability and usability. Gartner research say that we're moving into the localization hyper-automation era, where MT will be increasingly integrated into business workflows. Humans will be moved to high risk and high value work, and that there'll be an automation of the measurement of risk. And risk is a real key area. I'll come back to risk in a moment. There are two different concerns about sustainability that we might have with regard to these sort of translation workflows, both social and environmental. So I mentioned these sort of digitally tailorized workflows, or using Fordism, breaking things down into chunks. And the concern here is to do with whether translators are happy within their work, and whether we'll continue to have a flow of translators coming into the industry. So job satisfaction looks at factors like mastery, whether you feel like you've the mastery of your task, that you're contributing to something bigger than yourself, related to my question to you yesterday, Christos. And you talked about how these needs are fulfilled within the DGT. The sort of things that motivate us in our work, we have extrinsic motivation factors, according to Hertzberg's theory from the 50s and 60s, that can demotivate us if they're not present, things like money or holidays. If they're not present, we'll be dissatisfied, but they don't of themselves motivate us. The things that we're motivated by are intrinsic factors, the idea of contributing to this greater whole, to learning in your work, the idea of growth in your job. So trying to incorporate these factors within translation work's really important. And my feeling is that within these jobs that are broken down into micro tasks, this isn't a real consideration. Then environmental and ecological sustainability is a concern. So there was a well-cited paper by Emma Strubel and others that was published in 2019, where she talked about how researchers should prioritize computationally efficient hardware and algorithms. And this paper is still ruffling some feathers. Jeff Dean and others in Google put out a paper quite quickly refuting Emma Strubel's paper, and there were still arguments between the two about it on Twitter as recently as yesterday. But the measures that Strubel and colleagues made were that a transformer large neural network model, the amount of CO2 that they estimated that was emitted for training this model was equivalent to the output of 5 cars over the 20-year lifetime of those cars, just for training one large language model. And of course, since this paper was written, large language models have got bigger. There's also been more work on efficiency, but the efficiency work is not keeping up with the increasing size of language models. Jesse Dodge and colleagues suggested software carbon intensity information to be published in order to reduce the environmental impact. There was a paper by Roy Schwartz and colleagues in 2020 where they talked about green AI, and they argued that in artificial intelligence research generally, and that includes machine translation, that the focus is only on performance. And this is a problem with measurement more generally. There's been lots of discussions of post-normal science since 2010, and post-normal science is the realization that we can't just extract a variable and measure it, ignoring all others. And the tendency within measurements of AI is that we look at performance solely and ignore all other factors. So Schwartz and colleagues suggested that we should move towards green AI, also considering the environmental impact alongside performance. And the suggestion from Samuel Messick to do with measurement validity in 1988 he said that we can't separate the idea of validity of a measure from the social consequences of the use of that measure. So this holistic notion of validity is also important. Sterianov and Van Massenhove looked at ecological sustainability based on where the training takes place. So Dimitar and Eva used to live in Ireland. They carried out some training in Ireland looking at the origin, whether it was fossil or renewable origin of their power. Then they moved to Tilburg in the Netherlands and did the same work and compared. So sustainability will differ based on where you are in the world and what the origin of your power is. I mentioned translation risks earlier, and Kanfora and Ottman put forward a typology of translation risks, and this is important when we consider what MT is used for and how much review we put into our MT, what sort of context it's used in. So at the lower level, we've got communication being impaired or impossible, the loss of reputation, moving to financial damage, to legal consequences, to damage to property, and to injury or death. So there could be real risks of mistranslation, and there's been efforts to automate that, but the idea of automating that measurement of risk seems in itself quite risky. So Soloviev in the American Machine Translation Association conference in 2022 put forward this idea that we can divide our content for post-editing based on automatic scoring, and one level of it won't receive human review. In myself and Anna's paper looking at MT for the end user, we talked about these various different types of texts, low-risk, short-term text. So in terms of that sort of orthodoxy that I mentioned earlier, low-risk, long-term text, high-risk, long-term text, and try to divide the sort of some example texts into these categories to see what's commonly used, what sort of translation processes are used. But the context is not just these different types of texts. The context is also the amount of global data being produced, far more data than we have human translators to produce it. So much of that is real time, meaning that the translation is time sensitive. So there's a real need for automation to be used appropriately, and because the amount being produced is moving up, but the money available for translation is not, we're having to do more with less, essentially. We're going to see far more of this global data sphere now that text can be automatically generated. There's a real question of how much of this global data we should translate at all or should be concerned with. So I want to finish by talking about MT and vulnerable users. So these are some of the use cases where we might think about the users at the other end of this diagram of users who receive or use MT for long-term or short-term texts, high risk and low risk. And this is something that Barbara Houghton talked about a little bit yesterday in her talk, and about how, especially in a medical scenario, that users didn't want to use automatic translation tools. Carla Pérez-Gartin and Helena Moniz said, in a crisis scenario, MT should be implemented with caution and ideally under supervision of translators or others with high MT literacy. And I mentioned this concept of MT literacy earlier. Federico Federici and colleagues talked about how technology-driven automation rests on an ethically complex spectrum in which the human-machine interaction ought to be central to translation in cascading crises. But, according to Pat Cadwell and colleagues, MT is often necessary for survival in high-risk, low-shelf-life situations. There's a well-documented use case of MT being used in the Haiti earthquake, where Microsoft very quickly spun up an MT system that could be used for text messages. And MT being used in response to crises with common problems of underdeveloped technology for the language pairs in use, including insufficient data and available data coming from an inappropriate domain. These problems exacerbate existing quality issues with MT. And more recently, Vina Tassur talked about NGOs using MT increasing risk, causing staff frustration and the loss of staff time. So this is an example of inappropriate uses. Andrea Siribuco, who is now based in Galway, has reported pragmatic but uncritical use of smartphones and MT among asylum seekers in Italy. So some of the use cases carry little risk to do with watching TV, conversing with teachers, working in a garage, but there's a danger that uncritical use of MT will mean insufficient discrimination between these low and high risk cases. He talked about this need for translation, for survival, and he said that the people he interviewed might use online or mobile MT when a translator or mediator isn't available, in which case it fulfills a communication function but raises a risk of over-reliance. Dan Liebling in the US, he looked at non-English speaking immigrants to the US and he interviewed them, and they had experienced mistranslations that were inappropriate or dangerously inaccurate and reported having lost work or struggled to build relationships due to their use of free online MT and on smartphones for almost all of their interactions. Stefan Vollmer in Leeds also did his PhD on this topic. He interestingly suggested that the people that he interviewed had developed their own idea of MT literacy. They'd realized that MT was quite good for their communications with institutions like the Home Office because of the sort of language that was used. And they used MT as one of their digital literacy tools for communication, and in one case, to practice for a driving theory test. But the concern is the amount of hype to do with artificial intelligence. And as we saw in the Ellis survey that was published just last week, artificial intelligence, primarily considered an opportunity a year ago, is now mainly perceived as a negative trend, possibly based on ChatGPT coverage in press and in forums. And we can see that the coverage of ChatGPT is generally very, very positive. I haven't checked all of these 734,000 results, but we're seeing a lot like these ones on the top right, the top 10 most insane things that ChatGPT has done this week. Not so many like this article by David Golumbia, who is a long-time critic of technology and inappropriate uses, where he says that ChatGPT should not exist. Where I'm living at the moment, the government of Iceland have gone all in with ChatGPT. They've given all of their data. So because it's an EEA member, all of their translation of the sort of material that might be translated by the Commission is done in country in Iceland. So they have a lot of multilingual data from it. But they also have a lot of monolingual data, and that was handed over to OpenAI. So the risk here is that you're really putting the hands of your language in the digital space into an America-based company that has a profit motive, but their aim is to preserve its language. And this decision has been celebrated in Iceland over the last week or two. But like NMT, the output is inherently unpredictable. There was a paper that was published by Microsoft Research just yesterday where they put forward 154 different use cases for text generators and large language models. And the headline of the article is that it's a step towards the sort of general AI that has been talked about or artificial general intelligence that has been talked about for some time. But they also note that there are limitations in the word-by-word output, and that there are very simple things that the system still gets wrong. There's a lot of discussion within the large language model and AI community about alignment, not the sort of alignment that we talk about in translation, aligning segments with segments, but rather aligning tools with human needs rather than answering a question that nobody's asked. And there are discussions between the alignment community, the people who say that AI is going to kill us all, the AI skeptics, and then AI ethics, the sort of people who argue about the use of data and the disempowerment of people. But it's reminiscent of what Donatella Meadows said in 2001. For any objective other than the most trivial, we can't optimize. We don't even know what to optimize. The idea of trying to align these tools with specific needs on a very general or global level is something that's very difficult, and personalization is possibly impossible. So with regard to translation, as Cade Metz has said, it's an expert on some subjects. This is in the New York Times when he talked about GPT-4. It's an expert on some subjects and a dilettante on others. It can do better on standardized tests than most people and offer precise medical advice to doctors, but it can also mess up basic arithmetic is the word that's missing. An example here is myself and my colleague Shayla Castillo were, and this is such a trope showing you something from ChatGPT. Apologies, I'm sure this is going to appear in every presentation we go to from here on in. But the point here is that we took a segment from Dia Sintas and Ramayal's book on audio-visual translation and asked the system to translate this sentence into Brazilian Portuguese in fewer than 45 characters, cognizant of the limits for subtitling. And it created a good translation. And Shayla asked, how many characters including space is there in the previous sentence? And it answered, 45 characters including spaces. And Shayla said, no, it has 60 characters. I apologize, you are correct. The previous sentence has 60 characters including spaces. So some of the more obvious things these tools can't do. And these things that we might think are very obvious are actually quite difficult. In the past, Andy Zydron has presented about counting words and the difficulty of speccing a localization job. And as Johan Ratourier said in his book on localizing apps, defining what a word is not always straightforward. So we see here that any count words for a single document are 1010, and then different versions of Microsoft Word have between 430 and 764 words for the same document. In response to this, Andy and colleagues created a standard for word count. But even that standard is controversial because the idea of words is a very Western notion. And they said that 6 Thai characters were equivalent to 1 word, or 3 Japanese characters were equivalent to 1 word. These are very vague and Westernized approximations. So in terms of translation, it appears that large language models are very competitive for translation quality for high resource languages, while having limited capabilities for low resource languages, according to a paper by Hendy et al. And by combining the latest NMT systems with GPT models, they reckon we can achieve state-of-the-art translation quality. My colleagues in DCU said that GPT 3.5 for MT post-editing of the English to Arabic translation obtained from Opus, a big translation data repository, quality significantly surpassed that obtained from both Opus and the Google Translation API. And Tom Kochme and Christian Federman recently also suggested that large language models are state-of-the-art evaluators of translation quality. So it's very difficult to know how things will progress in translation. I'm certainly not going to make any predictions, but the advent of large language models seems to be changing how and what we use technology for in translation. But in closing, as MT and large language models improve, it facilitates more communication, but we need to consider the value, the risk, and the shelf life of text. The ethical concerns should be considered by all stakeholders in translation, particularly for PSIT when the content is for vulnerable users. So when working with and using MT and large language models, it's important to consider how it should be incorporated and the fit with your values, your purposes, and your principles. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. A very interesting presentation. We now have a few minutes in case somebody would like to ask a question, to make a suggestion, anything. No comments. No questions. Well, that's great. That means that was very clear, which it was, definitely.
Oh, here we are. Is there a mic? Do you want to come up and...
So
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it very impressive, and you gave us a very bright overview of the state of the art of ethical in translation. And my question is, how do you think we should connect all this in our classrooms? Because I think it is a very, very important topic, and we should in some way include it in our teaching. Not in a specific subject, but all of us should in our classroom talk about this topic, and maybe you can give us some tip or idea of how we can include it. Thank you.
Thanks. So far as I'm concerned, I've only, well, ethics is brought in a slightly inconsistent way in our program. I have one class on technology ethics as part of our translation technology module, and Dorothy Kenny teaches translation theory, so she brings in ethics there. And we certainly need to have a bit more of a holistic view of how we bring ethics in. Our university has a new project on transversal skills, where over the last 2 years they gathered us together to put together learning outcomes based on the UNESCO definitions of transversal skills. So that includes ethics, well, ethical decision making is what it's called, and I was part of the working group for that, and we created some learning outcomes. But it also includes things like media and information literacy and critical thinking. And the idea is that these will be implemented across all programs in DCU, and probably at the university level that's ideal, really. I mean, we'll come down to different applied areas depending on what topic we're teaching and learning, but there are some basic principles that might be useful for everyone. And from working for a few years in the School of Computer Science, I think that there's a view that ethics is only research ethics, and it's a bureaucratic barrier to get over. And really, they should be trying to make their research inherently ethical from the outset. So there's certainly a need for it, and we in DCU need to think harder about it. It's something we're also working towards, and we just put in an Erasmus Plus application across a few universities, ourselves, UAB in Barcelona, to try and create some materials for training for translation programs specifically. And it was an idea that came from our working group in the EMT network to increase the use of NLP, data literacy, and ethics, and try and have concrete methods, scenarios, and a book that has both a theoretical and practical part to use as teaching materials. So hopefully, if funded, that will be something we'll also work towards.
Definitely something to look forward to as training material. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Yes, okay.
Thank you. That was a very interesting and broad overview. And I was wondering, I have the impression that from our field, we are quite aware of the issues and also the possibilities maybe. But when we meet our counterparts, maybe that awareness is not as high, or maybe they haven't just arrived there yet. So I was wondering what you think about awareness raising and collaboration with other agents on the market, or or on a larger level, maybe institutions and similar.
So, Elizabeth, by counterparts, do you mean people in industry?
I think I mean everything from industry to government to European institutions. Yeah, everyone that sort of uses our services and are part of also creating this type of, like the Icelandic government, part of creating and recreating the big data.
It's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I gave a presentation about MT and ethics in the University of Iceland last December, and because Iceland is so small, you get lots of different stakeholders all coming in. So the head of the main government-funded MT company was there, plus translators, and I got the impression that he had never really thought about it, and so he asked me to come into the company and give a talk, which I haven't done yet, and then there was an argument between him and a freelance translator about the use of data. This is what happens when you get everyone together in a room. But I suppose that sort of outreach is what's important, and it's very difficult to get our voices heard outside of academia, and it doesn't help that our motivations are to publish in journals that are read by people within our own community. So I think my best answer to that is just outreach to try and discuss with people in industry and the various stakeholders that we come across. But it's it can be difficult to make those connections. I think generally, though, there's more concern about technology ethics. Certainly, it's more of a hot topic that maybe people are open to more than they might have been in the past, where it just didn't occur at all. Thank you for the question, though, even if I couldn't give a satisfactory answer.
I wasn't expecting a yes or no or set
Yeah.
answer, but I think it's an important discussion.
What's your perspective?
Sorry, what was?
What is your perspective?
No, I was impressed that you got invited to the university. I was also thinking when you were talking about the measurables, it's not only in the machine translation or things like that, but it's also in how we publish, like you say. So we will be more interested in publishing journals where we get the metrics rather than maybe have debates or doing a more popularized version. I think that outreach is extremely important, but I agree with you that it's very, very difficult. So I was more hoping for sort of tips.
And those sort of performance indicators for us as academics, that's another example of a very rough proxy measure, that doesn't really give a full sense of the value of our work, but something needs to be measured. The obsession with measurement and efficiency hits us there.
Okay, thank you. So we don't really have time for many other questions. So thank you again, Joss. It was a great pleasure. And we will now give way to the following. Well, we have the round table now. So whenever. Oh, sorry. There's a coffee break now. The applause is for the coffee break.
Gracias. Me alegra verte y conocerte. Es que esto de las conversaciones siempre así todo.
Que hace todos los años, ¿no?
Sí.
Nura ha venido ya otras veces.
Hacemos muchas actividades de este tipo. Este congreso normalmente lo hacemos solo cada 3 años. Ha venido gente de la Unión Europea, entonces bueno, aprovechamos. Entonces, a ver, como quieras. Deberíamos, espera, igual tengo que ir allá, a ver, es que hay como intérpretes también. Y es el técnico, espera, voy a ver si para que lo ponga él, porque no.
¿Qué sacamos? Este.
¿Este es el mío?
Es el. ¿Alguno más? Este.
Y voy yo navegando las hojas, ¿verdad?
Sí, con este.
Ah, no se puede...
Bueno, lo puedes hacer con teclado
vale,
también,
vale,
perfectamente.
sí, sí. Es que
Pues
quiero
ese.
ver
Bueno,
si-
mira, el de Madrid está aquí, lo hemos dejado aquí.
Vale. Y entonces,
Entonces,
lo puedo poner en
maximizamos.
Sí. Vale.
Y ahí ya
Y
está.
luego quiero poner en este. A ver. Vale. Y luego mostrar lista del moderador. Vale. Entonces, vale, perfecto. Y voy así.
Lo único, recuerda cuando termines quitar la vista de moderador antes, porque si no crea conflicto con él y con el proyector y no sabe que hay dos pantallas y nos vamos a fondo negro.
Pongo finalizar presentación.
Sí,
Vale,
ciérralo del todo.
vale.
Mira, vamos a hacer una prueba si quieres, a ver si funciona. Vale. ¿Ves? Ya se nos ha ido y ya no tenemos moderador. ¿Ves? Ya no es la misma pantalla. Entonces te digo que te crea conflicto.
Esto lo puedo poner más. Ajá, vale, perfecto.
Y es que no lo veo lo de vista moderador. Ahora ya no es lo mismo esa que esta. Desde aquí, ¿la gestionas tú la vista de moderador? Porque yo no.
Sí, incluso... no, pero este no va entonces.
¿Ves? Es que yo sé que crea conflicto con la pantalla y nos da mucha guerra. José, ¿cómo vuelvo a pantalla normal o a compartir? Porque no tengo la misma pantalla. Han puesto vista de moderador y ahora no tengo la misma pantalla. Sé que si apago lo saco, si no, no. ¿Apago, enciendo o compartir? Apagar y encender sé que sí salgo. Pero sé que hay una opción que es quitar, compartir o... ¿Apago y enciendo? Es que me lo va a volver a hacer luego. Porque quiere vista moderador.
Pero si no, luego lo retrasamos, son las 11, vamos, 2 minutos. No lo han dejado preparar. Okay, shall we start? Okay, good morning, everybody. Now we are starting our roundtable. This is going to be mix English and Spanish. So I just want to let you know that if you need, because we are talking in English and in Spanish too, so if you need interpreting, you can just, before we start, get the earphones. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that, you see, the topic of this presentation, as you have here, is teamwork in crisis situations. And so here we have 4 panelists. Each one is talking about a specific, not topic, because we are talking in crisis situations and the role, so the perception of the translator and the interpreter in different, or just the role of the importance of communication and how this happens in these crisis situations. So I'm just briefly introducing the panelists, and then I will turn into Spanish. That's it. Okay, so we have here on my left, first one, Paula Farias. She has been working in, I should say, for years and years. In humanitarian crisis, in humanitarian situations. Then we have, they will present each other better, but I just want to say a few words. Then Anka let me read that again, Soldabanu. It's okay? Sorry. Well, Anka Soldabanu, she comes from Clear Global, Translation Without Borders, and she's talking about very specific area. Well, now we know that we are with the Ukraine war, so well, she's specifically talking about, in this area, she knows it pretty well. Then we have Carolina Mateos over there. She's from the, where is that? Well, we say ACNUR in Spanish, but yes, that's it, UNHCR. And her topic is mostly dealing with refugees, because, with this, this organization. And then we have Angela Saxo. You know her because she's been here with us these last days. She's from, the CEO of Critical Link, but also she's a member of the RECT, an association that is really involved in the recognition of translators and interpreters in war situations, in crisis situations, and the way they are just considered, say that. So once that's said, now I leave the floor to Anka. Just a few words in Spanish. So Anka, for those that are using, so este es un panel, yo diría, de primera línea, and el tema es completamente diferente de lo que acabamos de escuchar de ética y traducción automática e inteligencia artificial. Esto es ya humanitario, o sea, no hemos bajado, simplemente estamos en un plano diferente, pero que obligatoriamente conviven, deben convivir los dos. En este caso, ahora Anka tiene la palabra. ¿Sí? Okay, you can introduce yourself better.
Okay.
The organization.
Yes,
Thank
hi,
you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to introduce the organization I'm working with, but also the humanitarian activities and the places we are being present. I am the country program coordinator for Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. As you probably know, covering these countries, they are bordering countries in working with Ukrainian refugees and also third national parties. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Clear Global is and our activities. So we used to be known as Translators Without Borders, but also we have grown very fast, and also we felt that we had outgrown our name. So Clear Global does provide a range of language services to 8 organizations and the humanitarian community. We also have Clear Tech and Clear Insights, so that's mainly on innovative technology development, IAE, language research, and also evidence building. So what exactly we are doing? I want to see why I cannot see the slides. No. For the second slide. So this is the first one.
Can you maybe then go to the definition? Oh, this is just the first.
Mm-hmm.
Have you started again?
Yeah, I'm starting again.
Can you help us? No podemos pasarlas.
Sí, pero déjame ver si... Vale, funciona. Perfecto, gracias. Mejor te quedas aquí por tu magia, ¿no? Y así funciona. Great. So what is Clear Global doing? We are helping to build a picture of the languages and communication, and that's mainly across the Ukraine response. We also have programs in Northeast Nigeria, which is a very multilingual humanitarian setting with more than 350 languages and dialects spoken, in Republic of Congo, Bangladesh, Mozambique, and so on. So in a nutshell, what we are doing, we are updating existing language data. We try to make a better understanding on gaps in language support. We are visualizing ongoing data, and also for the specific Ukraine response, we provide language services in 8 languages. We support organizations to address the challenges of humanitarian interpreting. First, we are conducting research and analysis to update the existing language data by identifying developments in language use in Ukraine since the 2001 census. We are also looking at interpreting between languages, that it's a never straight line, and I'm sure here being a room with specialized translators, linguists, and interpreters, we already know that it's never a straight line interpreting between languages. And there we kind of offer the solutions. We raise awareness of the importance of language support for an effective response. We develop operational guidance for NGOs, but also for the responders to work with ad hoc and also professional linguists. And at the same time, we are developing language-specific guidance on the most appropriate ways to translate terminology on key humanitarian topics, which is a very complex terminology that we are using in the humanitarian architecture. So very quickly, I'm going to go very quickly through the agenda. And I'm going to discuss a little bit why does language data matter in humanitarian action, what do we already know about the language and communication issues of those affected by the war in Ukraine, and how can addressing language make humanitarian program more effective and accountable. Right, so language can be a driver of vulnerability. As you can see there, we have language, access to aid, to education. It's very, very much interconnected. So it means that if those that they speak a marginalized or minority language, they also might be unintentionally or intentionally language-based exclusion from accessing healthcare, education, technology, but also representation. So the typical approach to language, usually we undertake a needs assessment where we assume that major or no official languages are enough. We do work on language support that is absent from the budget. We raise awareness on that. We look at the evaluation that the outcomes are not tracked against language. We also see that most of organizations rely on local staff and partners for the multilingual communication, but that doesn't necessarily imply that they are equipped to translate in humanitarian settings, especially that we have the concept of confidentiality. Great. So here we have kind of a language mapping that we've been working within 88 countries, looking at the marginalized languages. It's still not enough data, as more of research is being conducted as well. But here I'm looking at how local language data can inform communication strategy. And this is a map of the language of Ukraine. And it's basically also based on the 2001 census of population in Ukraine. Since then has not been, it hasn't been updated. But just at the beginning of the full invasion in Ukraine, we deployed our team of researchers, and we draw this language of map, where this is quite of interactive mapping, and I will provide you with the link where you can see that in different oblasts within Ukraine, they are majority and minority language speakers. So Ukrainian and Russian, it's not enough because there are more than 20 languages that are being spoken in Ukraine. Also, when we work with the humanitarian organization, we really encourage them to ask the right question on an ongoing basis. So the recommended questions is, what is the main language you use at home? What language do you prefer to receive written information in? What language do you prefer to receive spoken or signed information in? And how do you prefer to receive information? Okay, so war in Ukraine. What do we know so far about language and communication issues? As I stated earlier, the 2001 census shows that two majority languages used as a first language by 97% of population, but the remaining 3% use other 11 languages. And those also you have a language varying from Romani, Tatar, Romanian, Moldovan, and so on. Those 11 minority languages are recorded. Romanian is the highest just because of the bordering with Romania, but none of them are really high. And minority languages are also likely to be underreported. Within this map, as expected, the Ukrainian, which is in blue, is the most used language, followed by Russian in orange. But in certain areas, minority languages are also majority languages, which is a really poor assumption on that, especially when we implement humanitarian programming. Okay, so what's changed in the last 20 years? The language used today differs from the 2001 census. Language policies changes since 2001 because it did influence people's language use and language identity. And it's very important to make here a difference between language and identity. And now in Ukraine, most of the time, speaking Russian, it's really encouraged to be excluded. But on the south, on the east and south part of Ukraine, the mother tongue and the first spoken language is Russian. And that kind of also discriminate Russian-speaking people in accessing aid or information as well. So as you can see, those events, especially also since 2014, has also influenced how people relate to the two mostly widely used languages, and that's Russian and Ukrainian. Yes, so just to circle back on the language sensitivity between Russian and Ukrainian, when we interviewed and we made the research with participants, especially the elderly, we find out that yes, these people, they are the ones that they've been educated during the Soviet era. And obviously their first language is Russian. And now the transition on speaking from Russian into Ukrainian, it's quite difficult for them. So also this transition, it's been viewed in very different ways due to the evolving on a daily basis in Ukraine. Okay, so the Romani in the Ukraine language, these are the most marginalized languages. We can see that they are different, they are even not even treated as second languages. The literacy rates and educational exclusion, there is a distrust of information sources, lack of digital access, borrowed terminology, and quite huge differences between the dialects. Here it's a link that it does take us to our library. We have developed an online library and resources for those responders who are operating in Ukraine. And there you can see the languages of Ukraine. It's a map. It's quite interactive. I really encourage you to check it out. It's mainly in English and also in the translated languages for across border in the countries in Romania, Poland, Slovakia, Romani. Even in the Romani we have translated this fact sheet as well. So what are the key messages here when we are talking with the humanitarian community? Ukrainian and Russian dominate, and this can obscure minority language communities. We do recommend to be prepared for minority language speakers as a first language. Wide variety of minority languages, but data is poor and likely underreported. Here we do recommend in collecting data on language use to understand minority language needs. Russian and minority language speakers are more likely to be marginalized. And we really recommend to plan for additional resource requirements for marginalized language communities. When we done a survey last year in the 4 countries, so we started in Ukraine, in Romania, Moldova, and Poland, We came across, for example, in Romania, the responders, the humanitarian and the local organizations have low capacity to communicate with service users in Ukrainian or Russian, and capacity in marginalized languages is even lower. Where in Moldova and Poland, the picture is completely different. Moldova, throughout history, has like Russian language acts as the standard language between service users and service providers, but also information is quite chaotic and very hard to navigate. And in Poland, due to language similarity, basic communication is often possible, but people need clear information in their language about rights, contracts, and other integration issues. Let me skip this. Yes, so when also we talk with the humanitarian community, we also raise awareness on our services, but also on our training. We do offer a 3 days humanitarian interpreting, language awareness, language and communication in emergencies, and all that in a multilingual emergency setting. So we do always say that interpreting and translation are specialist skills. So really, although we often rely on our national colleagues to do the translation and the interpreting side. And we know that organizations also underestimate what language support involves, and staff really receive guidance on translating and interpreting a humanitarian setting, which it's a whole different landscape, especially when it involves complex humanitarian terminology. Here it's an example of a focus group discussion when we undertook the research, and it's about a mother that took the child for a consultation in Romania. And the doctor doesn't speak Ukrainian or Russian, and she has used her phone. She has translated with her phone. So the translation said, your cat has a red neck. So red neck because it has been mistakenly translated like a sore throat because the child was sick. So here it's just about to see the problem also of using automatic translation, but also the low capacity in having trained interpreters serving the Ukrainian refugees' needs when they need to access the humanitarian services or healthcare services, in this case in Romania. Okay, I'm going to skip this very quickly. I already talked about the problems. So just in a very quick nutshell, we really encourage the content of all information to be used on plain language, non-text formats, translation and interpreting in preferred languages, multilingual glossary, sign language as well, training for interpreters, data and research, and also listening and having more accessible ways to feedback services and track services provision at outcomes by language. This is the bit that I'm very fan of, and this is the humanitarian glossaries that we have developed across all responses where we've been working in Nigeria, Venezuela, and these are mainly based on protection, legal, medical terms, housing. I really encourage you to access these glossaries. They're translated in several languages. It also has an audio feature, and now we are working in adding a sign language feature. The glossaries, and just a little bit to make you understand the use of plain language. Here we have 2 parallel texts. The original language, you can see there that the content is quite heavy, the words are quite dense, and it's not really user-friendly. Where on the other side, you can see that the plain language, it's much more simple, everyone can understand it, And this is why we usually recommend the use of plain language, even though the content is quite technical. Great. So language and communication, I talked about this, and also I would like to stay at this slide because these are the resources that we have developed for the Ukraine response. There you can see if you follow the Ukraine response toolkit for humanitarians, and we'll be sharing the link with you. It's mainly fact sheets on how to work with interpreters and translators, practical tips for community interpreters, guide to interpreting and culture mediation, what is plain language, tip sheet, the Romani language fact sheet, and obviously the glossaries. And also we do have free online training courses on humanitarian translation and humanitarian interpreting. So I have come to the end of my presentation. I hope this you find it quite useful, and I hope I stay within the allocated time. Carmen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's go to the next one, and so at the end, if there are questions, we just have time for that. So the next one is going to be Angela Saxo, yeah? From, are you coming here? Yeah, okay. So as I told you, she's coming from critical link, but also RECT, and now she's talking about a different perspective, I think, even though everything is connected. So it's okay.
Yes, yeah. I'm just trying. Maybe we'll need the magic of the technician.
No,
maybe you can.
It can be probably. No, it's not working.
No, it's frozen.
Frozen. Oh. Come on.
Yeah, it's giving troubles.
Yeah, that's more. Yeah.
Presentation. Yeah, I think that.
I don't know.
Need to work on the adaptation.
El técnico, por favor. It's frozen. We need just to get on here and open the web page. No. Here he comes.
Okay.
Se ha quedado congelado.
¿Es esta la presentación?
No,
esta se ha quedado trastornado.
y abrir la web de web.
Está cerrada, ¿no?
Eso también.
Y era
Y abre
esta-
la página esa, the homepage. Now, yeah, it's okay. It's sorry for that. Yeah, it's okay. And it's working. Yeah, I guess you can
Okay.
open it and
Is this on?
yeah.
Yes, it is. Okay.
I just
Okay. Oh, it's not showing on the screen though.
no. Oh no. Sorry for that. Today is not our day. Yesterday it worked, okay, but it's not in there. And then check if you can just move. You can close that. We don't need that.
Orange.
So
Okay.
maybe.
Okay.
No, eso nada, quítalo.
Okay.
She's getting cold. If you have any question, maybe for Anka, we can just. Yo tengo una pregunta, Anca. Has hablado del romaní y de otras lenguas, pero ¿qué incidencia tienen? Supongo que son realmente minorías, pero ¿tienen realmente problemas de comunicación con la población ucraniana o no? ¿Son bilingües en algún sentido? ¿Ellos conocen la lengua o realmente hay problemas de comunicación en esas zonas con esa población?
Son las dos cosas. También hay problemas de comunicación. Sí, son las dos cosas. También hay problemas de comunicación, pero en cuanto a la información, esto sí que hay que accesar la información en plain language también. Y con la comunidad con quien estuvimos hablando, sí que requerían información en un formato y en un idioma que ellos hablaban y ellos entendían. Sí, no hubo problema de comunicarse en ucraniano o en ruso, pero las personas de edad avanzada sí que necesitaban más información del acceso a los servicios humanitarios en su idioma.
Otra pregunta, ¿a qué nivel utiliza Clear Global? Ya, porque la tecnología está ahí, se está utilizando para recoger datos. No a qué nivel, sino qué importancia tiene dentro de todas las actividades que la organización desarrolla, en qué medida está influyendo la tecnología, ¿no? Aparte de...
Sí, bueno, no queremos ser the devil advocates, ¿no? En este sentido, pero sí que estamos trabajando muchísimo con las organizaciones humanitarias para integrar el tema del idioma y de comunicación en todos los proyectos humanitarios. Y entonces es por eso cuando hacemos algún análisis, cuando estamos desarrollando productos, lo estamos haciendo realmente para nuestros compañeros dentro de la comunidad humanitaria para que lo usen. Por ejemplo, solamente el tema del training, ¿no? Para los intérpretes, sobre todo en el contexto humanitario. Y bueno, sí, pues tratamos de influenciar muchísimo, aunque ahora sí hay mucha sensibilidad con el uso del idioma de ruso en Ucrania. La mayoría de las organizaciones, incluso las autoridades, no quieren usar el idioma ruso, que esto ya puede llegar a ser... indirectamente ya está excluyendo a las comunidades que solamente hablan o entienden ruso.
Gracias. ¿Podemos continuar?
Yes, I think.
Okay, so now Angela Sachs is there.
Can you hear me? Oh, was it on? That's what I thought. My voice is so loud you can't tell. That has a partnership with Critical Link, AIC, FIT, WASLI, and YAPTI. Those organizations come together on project-specific area of open letters. Red Tea itself, Maya Hess, who is the founder and director, along with her board of directors and other volunteers, work on similar projects, of course. We're all working in the same vein, occasionally overlapping, but they are different projects. So I'll speak a little bit about both areas and hopefully do Maya's work justice, because she truly is an amazing individual, I have to say. She's nonstop. I don't know how she does it. So the coalition is primarily involved in the open letter campaign. The open letter campaign started in 2012 as a partnership with AIC, FIT, and Red Tea. Critical Link joined in 2015. There's an open letter that's being passed around right now. There's 2 copies, which is our latest open letter campaign that has gone out. The open letter campaigns can all be found under projects, under open letters. And the reason, you know, we joined forces with the open letter campaign was to, I'm not used to this kind of computer, sorry, was to lend an international voice to the work that's being done by Red T, you know, and speak loudly, both at an international level and at local government level as well, or regional governments or federal government levels as well. So the letter that you have, that you're viewing right now, is this one here that was sent out in November. And as you can see at the bottom, we also have qt.org, which is a Brussels-based organization. And so when we do organizations, when we do open letters specific to certain regions, this one is to the UN, but we also call in or enlist the voice and the support of organizations. For example, MSIT's been partner on some initiatives, and in Canada, you know, our CTIC and various other bodies or organizations will also come in. So this is the work that we've been doing since, Maya, Red T, IEC, and FIT since 2012, and Critical Link since 2015. There have been about 30 open letters since that time, since it's first started, and it has created movement and support and recognition at government levels, at decision-maker levels, which is what we want to have happened. And I just want to say that one of the things that has happened recently with this letter, so this latest campaign that we have here, no, this is not the latest, sorry. In 2021, we wrote an open letter to the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, urging him to extract interpreters and their families to a safe location. And we also sent a letter to the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg a few months before the withdrawal allies. So these open letters, you know, they keep coming, and the coalition follows up with them. And we did receive a response from the Secretary General, and this is a quote: "I have encouraged allies and partner countries to accept local employees, including interpreters who are considered at risk due to their NATO employment." So our goal with Red T goal and the coalition goal is to recognize the work, interpreters that work in conflict zones and to protect them and their families. And by also voicing the accountability that you know, partners have in the various countries where they are to the local interpreters that they have enlisted. So it's worked very well. It is working. There's lots to do still. That is the coalition work. Let me see now if I can accurately represent some of the high-level work or at a high level, the work that Red T has been doing. So what I've also sent around is, this field guide that is, I think here, it's going to get sent around. There's a field guide on how to work with interpreters and translators. This document was originally produced as one of the first joint partnership ventures with IEC and FIT and Red T. It is used even in local or national law enforcement, to train their officers or agents on how to work with interpreters and translators. It's been very well recognized globally. The other paper that I sent around was a database, an incident reporting database. So the latest initiative is to urge the UN to create a database to aggregate all the information for casualties for linguists in conflict zones. So we have that data from which to work and continue. But the real work with Red T that Maya and her volunteers and board do is on policy change. Ultimately, it is to create policy change. And let me just I didn't realize we needed a presentation. I'm good off the cuff, I hope. So I just wanted to give you an example of some of the work that's been done, but also wanted to talk to you. Policy? Here. So one of the, the policy change that Red Tea tries to enact is done through constant presence through the media, to provide media with research and information, to publish books and articles on information, to gather a rich store of valuable information that will support and move forward the aims of the organization. I also wanted to just share a couple of stories for some of the work that has been done. And I wanted to also say that while these stories that I'm going to tell you now, and these are like, Maya has offered these as examples. They say specific countries, but that is not to isolate these countries as the only perpetrators of, where incidents happen. They just happen to be the ones that are spoken to at this point. So in Uganda, a court interpreter working at the trial of alleged perpetrators of the Kampala twin terrorist bombings received death threats by text, understandably went on the run to most likely save his life. To give you a sense of the level of risk that was involved, the lead prosecutor was shot and killed by a gunman on a motorbike when she was on her way home with her children. So every day, the linguists that support the work, to support efforts are, their lives are in peril, and their family as well. I also wanted to talk about two incidences that in Canada successfully received two interpreters. Seem to have messed up my slides. Here it is. Sorry. Okay, well, I'll find it. But the work with Red Tea really is to support interpreters from moving to safe zones. So Maya and Red Tea have successfully helped several, but two cases that I wanted to share with you in particular, to move to Canada and support the paperwork, because sometimes obtaining the right documents for migration can be very difficult. So Red Tea has stepped in and done that work as well. The database is the most active work that's happening right now, urging the UN to create that database and pool information and resources. I think that's it. I mean, I can try, and my understanding is that Red Tea is working very closely with the UNHCR Spanish representative, but I'm once again, I'll leave others to speak to that. I encourage you to go on the Red Tea website. There's lots of information. All the open letters are here, and you can see all the open letters that have been done, and there's also the database collection should also be here, as well as the kit that you can, anyways, the guide, the field guide for working with interpreters and translators. Okay? Okay. Thank you. Did you pass it around?
Thank you, Angela. So now, Carolina, no? Carolina, let's see if we can just. Let's see how it goes. Now it's working. It's not working. Oh, yeah. Is that one?
No.
No. Yeah.
This one, the first one, actually.
Yeah. See? Is that? Oh.
That can
I'm Carolina Mateos. I work in UNHCR and in Spain, but my experience has been mainly abroad in different UNHCR operations in the world, mainly in emergencies. So I'm going to talk about how UNHCR works with interpreters and in the humanitarian world, which is the topics of the roundtable today, based on our way of working as organization, but also with some personal experience in the field. The main points, so these are the fifth one. I will mainly concentrate on some challenges that you all know, I'm sure, some good practices, and some, let's say, strategies or tips for interpreting in refugee context. So, yes, to set the scene, UNHCR is a UN agency. It's a United Nations agency created since 1950 in the aftermath of the Second World War, and we just celebrated commemorated the sad benchmark of 70 years in 2020. And as you know, the number of refugees in the world is sadly increasing year by year. We have reached the 100 million refugees last year with the Ukrainian crisis. UNHCR is a non-political organization and humanitarian and social. It means that we are present in different countries in the world, regardless of the political or regime governing in the country. It could be dictatorial, it could be democratic, it could be monarchy. UNHCR is called by member states, by UN states, member of the General Assembly, to support governments in their obligation to protect refugees, asylum seekers, and also other persons that are under our mandate. For example, returnees, those nationals that have been refugees abroad, they come back to the country, they still need some support to be integrated and in their own country. Stateless persons, so those who doesn't have a recognized nationality, doesn't have any nationality, because they are also in need of international protection. There are no country that protect them. And also as well, the internally displaced people, so the people who are fleeing persecution, violence, even natural disasters within their own country. Different to refugees, asylum seekers that are in a foreign country. They have fled their own country, they find themselves in another country where they need protection. So, as you can imagine, in UNHCR, in different countries we are present, we have different kind of activities. It depends on the state capacity, the institutions, civil society, host communities, where UNHCR can be and add value. We could do, for example, registration, meaning identifying people in need of international protection that need to seek asylum, helping governments to register them, giving them a documentation. We can also do refugee status determination, meaning helping governments to determine whom among the refugees, whom among the new arrivals or foreigners who arrive in the country are really refugees and those who deserve international protection. So it's based on individual interviews and assessments to determine if the people really need, they are in need of protection because the country are not giving them the protection they deserve. And as we will see, this has a crucial role in the interviews. There is a crucial role of interpreters, how to talk with people in a language we can communicate each other. And then, of course, we have other type of activities. Here we can see in the picture, for example, the first one is arrivals of refugees and migrants in Canary Island, where we also have a small presence, a small field office. And we work also with the government and the search and rescue agency like this one, Salvamento Marítimo, Red Cross, many humanitarian organizations, to identify among those new arrivals, those who need international protection, and then channel them to the appropriate authorities. For example, the police, to give them the identity, to give them the authorization to remain in the country and receive the asylum application. In the other picture, we can also see how we work with interpreters in an Ukrainian context in Spain, giving counseling to refugees from Ukraine who are arriving, and they also need to receive counseling information about their rights, about how to obtain the protection in the country. Now, in this context, what we need to have mindset is that the role of interpreter is key, because we are working in an international setting. We are talking with foreigners. As UNHCR or our partners organization, we are working with, not necessarily, and most of the time, we don't speak the language of the people we need to support and protect. So we need interpretation and translation services. Sometimes we do it, sometimes we need to hire them. And in this setting, in the humanitarian world, we need to go beyond the linguistic issue. Sometimes the interpreters, as also humanitarian workers we need to do, we need to go and put on the shoes of the other person, understand their culture, understand their gender or age sensitivities, understand that many of them are victims of trauma. They have been suffering a lot of abuses, human rights violation in their own countries of origin, also during the route until they reach a safe country. And they come with a lot of trauma that make them sometimes difficult to explain what is happening to them. There are communication barriers. So the role of interpreters sometimes is key to try to obtain, to communicate in two ways. Obtain information that the refugees wanted to communicate to us, and also to transmit the information in a clear language, in clear words, so they can understand. And sometimes the result, in most of the time, the result of an interview with a refugee is vital, in the sense that the result of the interview could determine if the person can stay legally in a country with a resident permit, with a refugee status, or they could be sent back because the authorities are not recognizing them as refugees, because they don't believe that the story that they're telling is true, is credible, or is enough to consider them that they deserve protection. So that is very important, that the interview with refugees or asylum seekers is done properly to save their lives. What are the challenges that we have for communicating? Well, can imagine in field work, sometimes, or most of the times, there are not many connectivity. There are no networks, no internet, there are power outages, no electricity, and sometimes we don't have proper offices. We need to work, we need to talk with people under a tree or behind the school where there are children studying or playing, and there's a lot of background noise. There is no possibility to move away of that because the lack of difficulty of transportation, or for security reasons, we need to be constricted to work in a specific area. So many times the setting, there are no private space. We need to manage and make it as comfortable, as safe as possible within these limitations. And then there is the other side of the challenge, the individuals themselves. Sometimes we don't find professionals available. We can see, for example, sometimes we can take interpreters among the communities. Even sometimes they are members of the family, the large family of the refugees or the internally displaced, because there are no other people in the community that they can talk the same language that we have seen with Ukraine. If they are speaking in a minority language, we cannot find many people who can translate in this language unless they are part of their community. So we have to do it, but we need to be conscious that there could be some bias there could be some principle that we need to ensure that is taken, not to avoid, for example, conflict of interest, or to avoid that the interpreter is not doing the interpretation properly because it's not comfortable. So another thing we need to take into account is that interpreters are humans, are people, and they have feelings. So they are not a robot, they're not a Google Translate, and sometimes when they need to translate a very dramatic story, a very tragic story, they also have emotions, and they cannot do it in a row. They need to rest, pause, assimilate what they are saying, and then try to do it as professional as possible. And sometimes we hire interpreters like in presence, or by phone, or through internet, through organizations that are supporting, and they're not familiar with the context, with the locations. And we're talking about a lot of cities, a lot of towns, and villages that they don't know how to pronounce them. They don't know how to write them. And then sometimes the communication can have a problem understanding on the names of the villages. And the person we are interviewing is illiterate. They cannot write the name, or can write it in another graphic, with another character. So this kind of interpretation could be also difficult. Or the problem is the situation of physical disabilities, such as hearing problems, speech difficulties, people who need translation in sign language, etc. So what we do, for example, when the people cannot explain in words, for example, the country. This is a real example of how the communication was transformed into a design of the village and the different areas where the people pass by when fleeing their village to cross to other countries. And then, well, they have to give the names. I think was Kenya, but I'm not sure. And sometimes, I think maybe it's in Africa, in East Africa, I'm not sure if Kenya. And well, this is a way of facilitating sometimes the communication. Some good practices. Well, in code of conduct, especially when there are no proper trained interpreters, there are some minimum principles, standards they need to ensure. Impartiality, neutrality, confidentiality, commitment, especially when we are talking about stories that need to be preserved only among those who are involved in the protection of that person. For example, if someone is fleeing persecution by the authorities of the country of origin, and the interpreter doesn't keep the confidentiality of the story and communicates to the embassy of that country that this person has said that this and that about them, and this person is now located in that village, they will put their life at risk. So that's why it's very important to keep the confidentiality. Then, glossary and acronyms terms, so I'm very interested in what we said in the previous presentation, because this is something that we need to harmonize and use as much as we can common language, because the humanitarian world can become also very technical. There's a lot of acronyms, even for ourselves, sometimes we don't understand between agencies, organizations. So this is something that we need to learn ourselves and also make the interpreters that available the same concepts. Literal interpretation could be a good practice in the same that the interpreters should not, the duration of the interpretation should not be very long, not longer, much longer than the original language statement. Because then it will be, there should not be scope for explanation, details, or judgment within the text or the speech that they need to translate. So a way of ensuring that there are not just say decoration or detailed explanation without being asked and without being said by the interviewer or the other interlocutor, then is to just keep it to the literal interpretation. But we know that sometimes the literal interpretation can become very technical. We have seen also in the previous presentation, if we become very, very, very literal and we don't put it on the message in a more comprehensive way, there could be also a problem of some misunderstanding. And then to ensure the message is understood, try to be as much as clear and simple language for people from different backgrounds, identities, and educational levels. Sometimes we say, just explain to them as you will explain it to your grandmother. If the person understands, very well. If the person don't understand, then you have to speak to your grandmother, which is deaf. Then you need to make extra effort to ensure the person is understanding what you're saying and double checking, avoiding jargon. Some strategies, and this is going to be just, I'm finishing soon. As I was saying, adapted to the circumstances of refugees, to the extent possible before starting an interview and providing interpretation services. Try to get to know the background of the person without being very personal, but try to ask general questions to the organization they are working. For example, sometimes with UNHCR we say, we are going to talk with a person from Venezuela. They are living in a country where there are different needs, and they have been a lot of people who have been fled in different countries in the Americas. So they are going to talk about a lot of countries. So try to put the interpreter as much as close as to the context, because we don't know if the interpreter had been already familiarized with this specific country or region. Ask questions slowly and in a friendly manner. So, because we're saying that people sometimes are victims of trauma, they don't want to talk about the problems. It becomes very heavy for them to re-memorize the events they have suffered. They need to understand also the reasons, and also not to be very strong or very heavy in the way of asking. This is, of course, the role of the interviewer, but the interpreter also has to adapt to the same approach. So empathy, patience, because sometimes there are a lot of silences. People need to maybe go to cry and come back, and people need to postpone the interview because they cannot continue. So all these things are issues to take into account in this specific context. Then the cultural sensitivity. Interpreting body languages, sometimes the people are not saying yes or no. Sometimes people are saying this to say no in some countries. Other people say this to say yes. So body language is also interpreting. And some words have different meanings depending on the culture. Sometimes in a Western world, we can say, who is your family? Maybe we understand your family, your parents, children, your partner. But for other cultures, the family could be the whole community. Their brothers could be all the men who had been living in the same neighborhood. This is a different understanding of the words. So this is also something that needs to be taken into account depending on the context. So when we are interpreting brother, we say, is he your brother? ¿Es tu hermano? He will say, yes, he is. If we understand this in a Western mentality, we can say, okay, they are the same father, same mother. But sometimes they will say, yeah, it's my brother. And then to re-emphasize that it's a brother, biological brother, sometimes they say, yeah, it's my brother, same father, same mother, which means that it's my biological brother. But they could be also brothers who are not from the same mother, same father, or only half brothers for us. But for other cultures, could be brothers or sisters. So gender issues, as much as possible, when there are sensitive issues relating to, for example, sexual violence or different cultures, women or girls prefer or need to be interviewed by female interviewers and interpreters. they be more comfortable. Okay, communicating with children, well, for children it's very complicated, as you can imagine. In this context, sometimes they don't understand what is going on, and the approach takes time. Sometimes there are need support of psychologists or social workers before doing a proper communication with children. So there are some trainings also specifically for interpreters on working with children and in refugee context. And there are trainings how to interact, how to interpret different kind of behavior, and this is also key to be taken into account. So there are some interpreters that are only especially to interviewing children. And then we were saying that interpreters are not necessarily available in the field. Most of the time, the person providing the services is a volunteer from the community or is someone who has not enough studies or preparation. So how to ensure professionalism within the limitations? Establishing clear terms of reference, establishing a checklist. What do you need to do? What should be done? What should not be done? Just to have some kind of guidance. And training, continuous training, language test, technical training, not only in the interpretation work as such, but also all the ethics and surrounding the situation of the refugee contexts. Monitoring and oversight. Sometimes there are also the possibility to do recordings, of course with authorization of the person involved for training purposes. And the recording is also very useful for ensuring consistency in the translation. Regular performance evaluation, complaint procedures for the services of interpreters, etc. And the last thing I think is important to take into account, because there is a lot of pressure and there is a lot of expectation for the work of interpreters, because I was saying before, it's vital sometimes. The result of an interview could determine if the person should stay here and be safe or go back to the country where their life could be at risk. So it's so important that the interpreters, of course, as the humanitarian workers and the states and the communities, they feel that they have to do something, and it's on their job, on their shoulders. Training on stress and trauma preparation, how to react during the interview and also after the interview, and psychosocial support. So lastly, this is just some tools and links where there's some handbooks or manuals available for explanation. Thank you.
No era el plan.
Ella va a speak in Spanish, so ya
Espera que se me ha liado esto.
Well, so I was not using the micro, but I said that she's speaking in Spanish.
Sí, voy a hablar en castellano. No sé si alguien necesita salir a buscar el... If somebody needs to get the headphones. I will speak in Spanish. Okay. Voy a hablar en castellano porque estamos en un congreso de interpretación, ¿no? Me parecía lo más coherente, además de que estamos en Alcalá de Henares y en la Universidad de Alcalá, que menos que hablar en la lengua de Cervantes, ¿no? Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Yo voy a hablar de la visión desde el terreno de todo este aspecto de la interpretación y la traducción. Comparto muchas de las cosas que ha dicho Carolina. La Torre de Babel es una maldición bíblica y, bueno, gracias a ella estamos hoy todos aquí, ¿no? Si no, no habría lugar a estas traducciones y a estos congresos. Y la Torre de Babel tiene muchas representaciones, pero sin duda alguna el campo de la acción humanitaria es una de ellas, ¿no? Es una Torre de Babel por definición. La acción humanitaria la llevan a cabo equipos en los que confluyen múltiples nacionalidades, y esto quiere decir múltiples lenguas maternas. Y a mí me gusta siempre establecer esa diferencia porque no tiene, por muy bien que hables un segundo idioma, no es tu lengua materna y esto genera situaciones de confusión a la hora de comunicarse. También en estos equipos confluyen múltiples niveles de formación, desde gente universitaria hasta trabajadores manuales, con todo lo que eso también implica a la hora de comunicarse. Y todavía más, a veces estos equipos no solo trabajan juntos, sino que muchas veces también conviven. Vives en un mismo lugar y bueno, esa torre de Babel no te da resuello, estás permanentemente en ese esfuerzo por entenderse unos a otros. Si además le añadimos la urgencia, que es una de las características de la acción humanitaria, pues de alguna manera esta apuesta sube, ¿no? Es un ejercicio específico la acción humanitaria que requiere de respuestas rápidas y de equipos especializados. ¿Y esto qué supone? Pues supone que muchas veces, la gran mayoría de las veces, es necesario expatriar a la gente. Cuando hablamos de cooperación al desarrollo, hay siempre un esfuerzo por tratar de buscar recursos locales, por tratar de bueno, mantenerse en el contexto en el que se está trabajando. Sin embargo, cuando hablamos de emergencia, esto no ocurre. Hay que traer la gente de fuera y, por lo tanto, esa sensación de Torre de Babel crece. ¿En qué idioma se habla en esta torre? Porque hay una especie de ilusión en que se habla inglés o francés. No es así. En la Torre de Babel se habla una cosa que se denomina International Broken English entre nosotros, ¿no? ¿Qué es el International Broken English? Bueno, es un inglés pobre, con un vocabulario escaso, con una sintaxis muy pobre, lleno de literalidades. Hay tantas cosas que dices que solo entienden los tuyos, ¿no? El clásico From Lost to the River o Because the Flies que decimos los latinos, ¿no? Bueno, son literalidades que no tienen ningún sentido en otro idioma. Y además hay un elemento de ilusión. Parece que no es tan pobre porque se utiliza mucha jerga, mucho tecnicismo, lo decía Carolina, ¿no? El mundo de la acción humanitaria, como todos los mundos, tiene su campo semántico y sus tecnicismos. Y entonces pues dices cosas que suenan muy bien. Hablas de operational strategies o non-food items distributions, y entonces se genera una cierta ilusión de cómo va a ser un lenguaje pobre cuando utilizamos una terminología tan alejada del lenguaje vulgar, ¿no? Evidentemente esa burbuja se pincha en el momento en que sales de ese campo semántico. Y en ese broken English es cierto que a veces, bueno, hay cosas que quedan fuera. Cuesta construir metáforas, cuesta construir ideas complejas, nuevas. Cuesta hablar de temas de los que no has hablado ya 1000 veces, ¿no? Tenemos un lenguaje común, no se nota que el fondo de armario que tiene tu inglés no es el deseado, ¿no? Y la paradoja de todo esto es que es precisamente los anglos, ¿no? los nativos, los English natives, los que más sufren ese broken English, ¿no? Son los que peor se comunican. ¿Y cómo es posible? ¿Cómo es posible que un armenio se comunique mejor con un argentino en ese inglés pobre y escaso que con un angloparlante, ¿no? Bueno, esto yo creo que tiene que ver, y creo que es interesante, porque tiene que ver con el esfuerzo en el comunicar. Cuando uno no habla su lengua, pone todos sus poros y todo su afán y todo su gesto y toda su mímica y todo su cuerpo en ese tratar de comunicarse. Cuando estás hablando en tu lengua, das por hecho muchas cosas y el esfuerzo no está ahí. Es de alguna manera una cuestión de actitud, y es cierto que los anglos pues nunca han tenido que cultivar ese esfuerzo y por eso a veces les cuesta más comunicarse. Yo os voy a contar una pequeña anécdota para hablar de esto, del comunicar fuera de las palabras, que creo que es algo que es muy trascendente en el campo de la acción humanitaria. Yo tengo un amigo que es fotógrafo, trabaja en Médicos Sin Fronteras. Bueno, yo vengo sobre todo de Médicos Sin Fronteras, ese es mi background, no he empezado por ahí, pero bueno, llevo toda la vida dedicada a la acción humanitaria y sobre todo en Médicos Sin Fronteras, aunque bueno, también he trabajado y trabajo en más lugares, ¿no? Este amigo mío es fotógrafo, como digo, de Médicos Sin Fronteras, ha recorrido medio mundo, ha estado en, no sé, 70 países trabajando. No habla inglés prácticamente y habla y francés también. Habla un inglés y un francés absolutamente precario y escaso. Pero esta persona es tartamuda. No por eso calla, no para de hablar, ¿no? Pero habla con todo el cuerpo, con cada poro de su cuerpo. El tipo está permanentemente en ese esfuerzo por comunicar. Y yo recuerdo en Afganistán con él, en las montañas ahí perdidos en la cola del Hindu Kush, en un campamento de milicianos, en una situación bastante delicada, que estábamos intentando negociar un acceso, y de pronto coge este amigo mío y se pone a contar un chiste en castellano. Y yo le miré y dije, estamos muertos, o sea, ¿qué estás haciendo? Y el tipo continúa con además un chiste largo, de esos que van enlazando, ¿no? Una cosa con otra. Y de pronto veo a los afganos, milicianos con pinta de cualquier cosa menos de amistosos, cómo empiezan a cambiarles el gesto, cómo empiezan a reírse en cada inflexión de voz que pedía una risa en el chiste, ¿no? Y cómo al final concluye el chiste y todo el mundo en el búnker arrancó en una carcajada. Lo había contado en castellano, pero lo había contado con todo el cuerpo, como hablaba él, ¿no? En ese estar en un esfuerzo permanente. Yo aquel día aprendí mucho, ¿no? de cuánto importante es el alrededor, cuánto importante es lo que acompaña las palabras, cuánto importante es la mímica, el gesto, lo que no se dice, pero que de alguna manera comunica, ¿no? Y creo que esto es una cosa crucial a la hora de interpretar y de traducir. De todas maneras, este International Broken English no sirve siempre, a veces hay que salir de esa burbuja y entonces es cuando entran en juego los traductores o los intérpretes en el terreno. Y a mí me gusta lo de la palabra intérprete precisamente por eso, porque lo que le pides a ese compañero no es que te traduzca, es que te interprete, es que te preste su mirada, que te preste su forma de entender las claves de lo que está ocurriendo, porque para él es un entorno conocido o más cercano que para ti, que eres ajeno, que acabas de llegar o no, pero aún así eres de fuera y hay muchas claves que no entiendes. Y por lo tanto le pides eso, le pides no que te traduzca, le pides que te interprete la realidad. Y bueno, un clásico es pues esas preguntas que elaboras durante 10 minutos y que coge tu intérprete y las traduce en una frase, ¿no? Y luego esa respuesta elaboradísima y larga de la autoridad de turno o el líder local de turno o el ministro de turno, en el caso del ministro no tanto, pero cuando hablamos de autoridades más de terreno, ¿no? Como una respuesta larguísima te dice, no, que ha dicho que no. ¿Cómo que ha dicho que no? Pero algo más ha dicho muchas cosas y dice, no, solo ha dicho que no. Y es que probablemente solo haya dicho que no. Todo lo demás ha sido interpretado, ¿no? Y bueno, y ahí entra el elemento que entra en juego es hasta qué punto tú tienes confianza en tu intérprete y en su capacidad de leer esa realidad, ¿no? Estos intérpretes tienen diversas procedencias. Cuando estás en una ciudad, pues es posible que tengas acceso Y hablo de Médicos Sin Fronteras, luego hay organizaciones que quizá tienen más estructurado el mundo de las posibilidades de interpretación, pero en nuestro caso lo más posible es que tengas acceso a un intérprete con experiencia, a ser posible en otras organizaciones también, de manera que entiende nuestra jerga, entiende nuestra forma de trabajar, entiende los principios humanitarios, y bueno, es una persona que va a ser capaz de hacer una interlocución a nivel autoridad, ¿no? A nivel ministerial, a nivel... pero como digo, estos serán los menos, serán los intérpretes que consigues en capital. Pero luego está la realidad del terreno, que lo que normalmente consigues es una persona local, muchas veces el único del pueblo que habla inglés o francés o alguna de las lenguas colonizadoras, ¿no? Que son inglés, francés, portugués y castellano. Esa persona puede que sea la única, ¿no? Y aquí de nuevo se introduce un sesgo, y lo comentaba Carolina, ¿no? Si es la única, si es una persona significada, también te tienes que cuestionar hasta qué punto vas a poder tener acceso a lo más vulnerable del pueblo, ¿no? Hasta qué punto su lectura no va a estar sesgada, hasta qué punto no hay un conflicto de interés, ¿no? Al final el intérprete es también el grifo que reparte, ¿no? Y bueno, hay que tener mucho cuidado también en ese sentido, porque estás escogiendo a alguien muy significado en el lugar. A estos intérpretes, tanto a unos como a otros, se les pide versatilidad. En el caso del intérprete rural, quizá no tanta, pero en el caso del intérprete de capital, esa persona que es capaz de hablar con un ministro y que entiende el mundo humanitario, le pides también que vaya contigo a terreno y que entienda a la comunidad. Como si el hecho de tener un pasaporte congolés, de alguna manera, te permitiera también entender hasta la última aldea de un país tan complejo como el Congo, ¿no? África, con su multitud de dialectos, de tribus, ¿no? Esa complejidad tan absoluta, esas fronteras trazadas a escuadra y cartabón, ¿no? Pedirle a veces un intérprete que viene de capital está tan lejos de lo rural como puedes estarlo tú. Y esta es la primera paradoja. A veces es más interesante tener un intérprete local de inglés escaso, pero que entiende el contexto, que entiende esa realidad, que es capaz de interpretártela, frente a tener un intérprete mucho más cualificado, con un inglés mucho más rico, pero que sin embargo está tan lejos de esa realidad de terreno como puedes estarlo tú, o bueno, menos, ¿no? Y además con esa burbuja de ilusión de que como está hablando en otro idioma que tú no conoces, parece que está entendiendo lo que está ocurriendo, ¿no? Y creo que eso hay que tenerlo muy presente, ¿no? Esa heterogeneidad que hay en el contexto, ¿no? Para no caer en esa idea errónea de que tu intérprete, solo porque hable el idioma, está entendiendo lo que está ocurriendo. Y luego hay otro elemento que se le pide a los intérpretes y que se ha tocado también ya en la mesa previamente, y es la neutralidad, como si esto fuera posible. Cuando, por ejemplo, en Médicos Sin Fronteras se recluta un jefe de misión, obligatoriamente tiene que ser una persona expatriada. No puedes tener un jefe de misión en Colombia que sea colombiano, no puedes tener un jefe de misión en Congo que sea congolés. Y no por una cuestión de capacidades, sino por una cuestión de que es muy difícil que alguien del lugar consiga mantener una neutralidad ante determinadas cuestiones. Una persona del lugar se va a quedar ahí cuando tú te marches, ¿no? Tiene familia, puede estarse de alguna manera coartando posibilidades. Es decir, la neutralidad es mucho más difícil cuando estás en tu propia casa. Pues con los intérpretes ocurre lo mismo. Pedirle a un intérprete neutralidad en un lugar de estos es no estar dándose cuenta del contexto, ¿no? Y más aún cuando hablamos de países en los que hay violencia, países en conflicto, países en los que bueno, el comprometerte a ti te compromete a ti, a tu familia y tu futuro. Es decir, que al final hay que tener mucho cuidado con las cosas que se le piden a un intérprete, porque hay que tener en cuenta, lo comentaban antes las compañeras, ¿no? Los intérpretes se quedan ahí. Y bueno, os voy a contar una anécdota que tiene que ver con esto, ¿no? con el cómo las situaciones difíciles a veces, bueno, comprometen, y tiene que ver también con la confianza en un intérprete, y en este caso pues una situación que yo pasé en la que realmente que mi intérprete me interpretara a su manera a mí me salvó la vida, ¿no? Estamos hablando del Congo, hace ya años, en una zona de conflicto, y bueno, en aquel momento estaban los Mai-Mai. Los Mai-Mai son unos guerreros tradicionales que, entre otras muchas cosas, piensan que si se pintan con unas pinturas que tienen ellos especiales, se convierten en hombres invisibles y además las balas no les atraviesan. Nosotros estábamos trabajando en un hospital allí, estábamos todo el día cosiendo balazos porque parece que la pintura no funcionaba. Pero bueno, los Mai-Mai han degenerado mucho, también con toda la guerra de Ruanda, cruzó mucha gente y al final se convirtieron en grupos totalmente eclécticos y desquiciados, ¿no? Con muchos niños soldados, muchos chavales soldados. Entonces un día íbamos con el coche, el intérprete y yo, camino de una aldea, y de pronto nos paró un control de carretera que habían montado una panda de chavales que se autodenominaban Mai-Mais, ¿no? Los vimos de lejos y bueno, nos acercamos y yo le dije al intérprete, bueno, ahora explícales que somos Médicos Sin Fronteras, que somos neutrales, ¿no? Toda la parrafada esta humanitaria de quiénes somos y a qué venimos. Y cuando nos paramos, el chaval dijo algo en su lengua y el intérprete se puso blanco y empezó a contestar, empezó a echarle una parrafada, no sé muy bien qué le estaba diciendo. Y cuando termina nos dejan pasar y me dice, le digo, ¿le has explicado lo de la neutralidad? Y dice, no, le he explicado que hemos parado porque los hemos presentido, porque su presencia es muy grande y llena toda la selva. Y digo, ¿y eso? Dice, es que me ha dicho que por qué hemos parado si son invisibles. Es decir, que gracias a que el intérprete decidió ignorar todos mis consejos y contestar de otra manera, pues salimos adelante, ¿no? Bueno, es una anécdota, pero creo que lo que quiero decir con todo esto es que, desde luego, en el terreno es muy importante las palabras, pero también es muy importante todo lo que ocurre alrededor, todos esos gestos, y más aún cuando hablamos con gente que está sufriendo, que está pasándolo mal, que hay violencia detrás, que hay miedo, ¿no? Hay que saber interpretarlo todo y sumarlo todo a esa traducción para de verdad estar interpretando la realidad. Bueno, pues nada más, muchas gracias.
Bueno, gracias Carolina. Tenemos una visión distinta. Entonces trataba la mesa redonda en sí de trabajo en equipo y cómo efectivamente los traductores o los intérpretes o las personas que hacen posible la comunicación, pues en estos equipos de ayuda humanitaria, qué papel, qué función, cómo se les ve, ese era un poco el tema, ¿no? Entonces ahora queda ya el tema, las preguntas. O sea, si tenéis preguntas, cuestiones que hacer a cualquiera de los miembros en inglés o en español. Sí, ahora viene por ahí el micro.
Gracias. Hola, bueno, enhorabuena por vuestras presentaciones, que me han parecido fabulosas. Tenía una pregunta que puede ser para todos, para todas, pero quizás más para Carolina y Anka, que lo han mencionado expresamente, que es la cuestión de los recursos terminológicos, ¿no? Incluso Anka tú has dado un enlace, ¿no? con una referencia a glosarios. Quería preguntaros cuál es la metodología y de qué manera compartís o no compartís, si los difundís fuera de vuestra institución, si interactuáis con otros actores intercambiando datos, si tenéis una metodología, una plantilla específica, cómo validáis los términos. Lo digo porque, aunque yo soy traductor, mi verdadera vocación y gran parte de mi trabajo es como terminólogo, ¿no? Y dentro de poco me reincorporaré al puesto de terminólogo, y es una pregunta un poco interesada por compartir, por ver si hay posibilidad de compartir recursos o de alguna manera beneficiarnos, ¿no? Y también aportar nuestro conocimiento a vuestros proyectos terminológicos, ¿no?
Sure, yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, terminology is quite complex, especially in the humanitarian sector. The way how we work with the terminology, it's for each sector. It can be protection, it can be food, it can be security, housing, or legal assistance. So we have teams that they are in the field, and we usually go and we do a field testing. We harvesting that terminology. We as humanitarians, and maybe my colleagues also agree here, we tend to speak very much in jargon and humanitarian terminology, especially when we communicate with the communities. So also the terminology, food security, how would you translate food security in a humanitarian setting? In Northeast Nigeria, our translator, and we picked up that, they used to translate it as army or guard army that will guard the food. And that will be translated to the beneficiaries or the persons of concern, which it's not correct. Another term, gender-based violence, in Rohingya language, the word gender doesn't exist. So it has been translated as a violent woman, which is a completely different significance on that meaning. So we, first of all, we take the sector, and then we start harvesting the terminology. We do consultation with the humanitarians, with the local NGOs or the local CSOs, but also we do consultation with the humanitarian community. And once we identify those terminology, we also go and we do the field testing after we do the translation and so on. After we do the field testing, then we come back and then we brainstorm again, because as I said, the meaning can have a twisted aspect of it. But this is kind of our methodology. In terms of sharing, yes, our glossaries, especially the humanitarian ones, are being shared widely with the humanitarian community. We receive fundings, and we have very generous partners also who are working with us in growing and making sure that that terminology database it's being updated as well, and also adding more languages as we speak, even marginalized languages, not only the UN languages such as English, French, or Spanish, but mostly those that are being used in the very much marginalized and hard to reach areas.
Bueno, no tengo mucho más que añadir. Clear Global es la organización experta y ACNUR tenemos también, nos sumamos a la diferente comunidad humanitaria para tratar de armonizar el glosario. No sería adecuado tener cada organización su propio glosario, porque a la hora de ponerlo en común en el trabajo de cooperación sería muy raro. Entonces, al final es cuestión de una comunicación constante, porque el lenguaje está en constante evolución y todo el tema de los derechos también. Aparecen nuevos tipos de formas de persecución, como la violencia de género, pero también pues, todo lo relacionado con el cambio climático, las nuevas tecnologías. Igual que el lenguaje evoluciona, el trabajo humanitario es el mundo real también, entonces se tiene que adaptar a ese lenguaje. Y también pues, muy importante lo que ha dicho Anka, que el testeo en la comunidad. Porque para digamos, los grandes idiomas que son oficiales de las Naciones Unidas y que son más comunes, aunque luego es verdad que se usa el broken English, no es el inglés, digamos, académico, pero es más fácil la interpretación literal. Pero sí es verdad que a veces el glosario necesita ir más allá de la traducción de palabra por palabra y a dar una explicación de lo que significa food security en ese contexto. Entonces ahí pues no se puede interpretar sin el feedback, o sea, sin las sugerencias de la propia comunidad.
Gracias.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Thank you very much to all of you. It was really very interesting also to see how there are different perspectives of everything we are discussing at this fora in these last few days. But I have a question also for Anka and for Carolina. And thank you also for providing us more insight into how the strategies are created in your organizations. And I want to ask about a group of people who are in need of help of your organizations, who are people with specific communication needs. And you touched upon that a little bit. You mentioned that you are working on strategies with sign language, and also I think Anka, you mentioned the dictionary. That's very interesting. But the group of people with specific communication needs is huge, and I know that already in your settings it's probably impossible to address everything. But I'm thinking about it also in relation to what Carolina said, how important the first interview is and what all should be expressed and provided in that interview. And if I'm thinking about people who have specific sensory needs, visual impairments, cognitive impairments, there is a lot which goes into the empathy communication process, gaining some trust, helping to provide a proper communication, and that's still speaking from Western perspective. I can't really imagine that in, for example, African context. That's something very different. So my question is actually very simple. I wanted to ask if your organizations have some clear strategy on people with specific communication needs besides the linguistic communication needs, and if so, if this strategy is maybe designed with the inclusion of people with specific needs who can provide their own perspective or experience. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so this is one of the most important challenges. If already the interpreting is very challenging, because of what we have said in the table, in a normal context, humanitarian context, because of the different cultural sensitivities and limitations, but with the person with disabilities, different kind of disability, we have to make extra effort. Specific projects, for example, before interpreting or translating, we need to provide a person with a hearing aid, for example, or make the interpretation, I mean the communication in different means of communication, not only one, not only hearing words, but also reading, or reading it in Braille. No? This has to be translated into projects. We cannot take it for granted that we will find adequate, person who can read in Braille or can use the sign language in the field. We need to hire someone or hire this technology to use it when needed. So these are resources. And then when we are talking about communication in general, not to take for granted that one mean of communication fits all. So use 2 or 3 at the same time. For one poster could be readable, could be audible, and also in different languages. No? That's why many information material are developing into QR codes, where you can download videos or audios from the words that you are reading on the poster. And yeah, so, but this is just for reading and reading and listening. Then, of course, there is the intellectual impairment, which is also you will need a specialist. You know, like you need specialist to talk with children or victims of trauma. You need specialist to talk with person with different intellectual impairment. So, yeah, and when we don't have it in the organization, we have to look for the specialist ones supporting, like maybe yours.
Yes, that's a very interesting question and very good. Yes, I agree with you, Caroline, at many levels. Inclusiveness, it's the top of the agenda in all humanitarian programming. And yes, there are some markers to take into account, not only people with disability or hearing impairments, but also gender and age markers as well. We are talking about vulnerable people, people at risk, LGBTQ plus as well. So all this encompasses. The way how we usually work, and that's also in the humanitarian sector with my colleagues from the UN as well, we usually do assessment. We do like an information needs assessment. And the humanitarian coordination, it's quite strong between the humanitarian organizations. There are few organizations in the field that they are really specifically working with targeted people at risk and vulnerable. So we learn from them. Clear Global is very much specialized on communication, on language, interpreting, complaints and feedback mechanism, accountability to affected population, but also we're being complemented with the information from other organizations on, for example, introducing sign language to the glossaries. How is that effective? So it's not only that we have to do that, we need to go into the communities and listen to the communities to really understand that there is the need for sign language. Yes, in terms of products, and it's very interesting what you just said. For the Ukraine response, there is an overload of information, especially QR. Yes, Ukraine is a heavily high-tech country, but still we are talking about communities who are in very hard-to-reach areas, in Russian-controlled areas, that there is no coverage. So no matter how much you have leaflets and posters with a QR code, communities cannot access that. And then again, the example of Paula here and Carmen, when you give information to people affected by crisis, you need also to think, how would you convey that information to your own grandmother or grandfather as well? Specifically with Ukraine, most of the elderly people have decided to stay behind. So those are the most difficult to reach, but it's very much on the agenda to start addressing the needs, communication needs as well. But also on any other disability needs. But yes, it's very complex, and I agree, one size doesn't fit it all. So the communication, if you have just a leaflet, doesn't mean too much, because nowadays you have kind of a leaflet with lots of wording and less pictorial communication, and you don't even understand what does that even mean. Or you have a QR, or you have a hotline or helpline, just calling there. So I do agree we live in an era of overloading information, misinformation, disinformation as well. But also we are all trying, with the help of the communities we serve, and this is what we owe to them, to provide clear information in plain language and in a very friendly user format, especially in the emergency and humanitarian settings. I hope that answered your question. Okay, thank you.
Is there any other question before we finish? Well, I have just a question, and I think it's for all of them, I don't know, but we have been talking about these multidisciplinary teams, and so I guess there are different professionals working there. And I wonder, I don't know, I mean, more than a question is just to know your opinion, no? Because we have been talking before about ethics, and so how much aware are all these professionals when they are using automatic translation, I mean, Google Translator and all this? How much, are they aware of the principles of confidentiality and trust? Because all this information goes to a server that they don't have any control of it. So what happens with all this confidential information that it's there? So I don't know if you can say something about this. I don't know, it's maybe there is not an answer, but at least to know your opinion.
You mean how the interpreters are aware?
Not interpreters, no, the interpreters, I guess we are aware of the terms of confidentiality, but if it is a multidisciplinary team, I mean, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, I don't know. So what happens with these people that they use? This automatic translation, I mean, it's a way of communication. I mean, if you don't have any other resource, what happens? But there is using without, I mean, do we may need some training, I mean, in general, about this? What happens with all this information that is supposed to be confidential and it's not disappeared, it's somewhere,
Well, it is about ethics, but it's also about law, because data protection, I mean, it's something that we need to preserve in every communication with an individual, and disclosure of personal information has to be had to give the consent. How much people are aware? I don't think many people are. I think it's our role in a different process we are working to remind them, and also to ensure that there is at least, for example, in UNHCR we have projects. We need to, apart from training and all people involved, kind of someone who can do the oversight. Like someone is the focal point, as we say, which is also a broken English, or cooperanto, as we say, this language we had invented. Focal point, someone who say, okay, you are in charge of overseeing that no one is going to breach data protection. No one is going to disclose anything confidentiality. It doesn't mean that we will comply, but at least try to put it in a standard procedure. But I don't know, it's very difficult, and especially when there is no control and you don't even know what is going to happen with this information. It is in a database, you don't have control.
But I think Carmen was asking about the tools, right? The Google Translate.
If they use this, using these
But
tools.
I think those tools, they don't keep the information. You use it and then you cannot.
No, they go to
well,
the server.
of course, everything is. We are in the Big Brother, yes. But when you use it and you try to recover it, you cannot, because they say it's not keep it. So, but I'm not an expert. But
I guess you cannot recover it, but it's somewhere. I assume, I mean, somewhere, somebody, I mean, that's why the big data somehow
but you
are
don't
collected.
keep, but I mean, keeping data, it's also an expensive procedure, so you don't keep the things that you are not interested in. Well, I don't know. I don't think so.
No, in the big servers. Okay, well. So thank you, the panelists, thank you all of you for all this information, thank you to the audience, and now I think it's time just for, I mean, I think there is the posters exhibition, or yes, there is another activity, so you can just, thank you all of you. se puede sacar. Es que